Some life situations can surprise you and have a lasting impact. That was precisely how I felt. When Mason unexpectedly entered my bedroom, it was a routine day at work for Nathaniel, my husband, and Mason, his son from a previous marriage, who had recently moved back in after a difficult separation. Since then, we've taken care to prevent any conflicts by carefully maneuvering around each other. I was in my room, looking at dresses for an upcoming occasion. I was in the middle of changing my underwear when the door opened unexpectedly. Subscribe to my channel so that I can continue to bring you more intriguing real tales like this one. And don't forget to watch this video all the way through and like it, because this story is going to be extremely entertaining. Please show your support by hitting the like button. Madeline, have you ever seen Mason Nathaniel? When he saw me in my undressed state, he stopped speaking. Mason cried. I gasped and quickly grabbed something to cover myself. He stuttered and hastily turned around. The door slammed shut, nearly falling over itself, leaving me standing there, embarrassed and perplexed by what had just happened. It was a moment that none of us could shake as Mason walked back in. The mood was uncomfortable. Nathaniel had decided without asking me, which surprised me, because he frequently made snap decisions without considering how they might affect others. Mason needs a place to stay for a bit, he stated one evening, scarcely glancing up from his phone. You do not mind, do you? Of course, I had no objections. Mason was always courteous but aloof, and our relationship had always been respectful, if superficial. Yet having him there as a continual reminder of Nathaniel's past caused an unseen tension at 25. Mason was extremely gorgeous, with black hair and a strong jawline, exactly like Nathaniel. Though his eyes were softer and more contemplative, his calm assurance highlighted his anguish when revealed she cheated on me. I had tried to maintain a light-hearted conversation, but his directness surprised me. Oh, Mason, I am so sorry, I said honestly. Do not be empathetic. He gave a shrug. It occurs. It all began one Wednesday. Nathaniel was at work in the afternoon while Mason was supposed to be conducting errands. In my room, trying on a dress for a charity banquet. The garment did not fit as I recalled, so I flung it on the bed. With a groan, as I stood there in my underwear, rummaging through my closet for new clothing, the door opened again. Madeline, have you heard Mason Nathaniel's voice? He paused in the middle of his sentence to take in the scene. I paused, still holding a hanger, as his eyes shifted from me to the floor. His face grew scarlet, and he swung around, nearly knocking down a lamp. I'm sorry, he stuttered, retreating out of the room. I gasped and hastily grabbed a robe to cover myself at the door. Slammed shut, leaving me standing there with my pulse beating from shame. The remainder of the day was awkward. I avoided Mason by keeping in my room and appearing to be busy, despite my mind being consumed with the situation at dinner. The tension was evident. Have you finished your errands today? I inquired, trying to seem casual. Yes, he replied. Looking up from his plate, Nathaniel gazed between us, unconcerned about our discomfort. I advised that Mason take some. He agreed that taking some time off to find out what he wanted to do next was a smart idea. Mason eventually looked up as I spoke, despite the fact that my voice sounded unusually bright. I appreciate the hospitality, he remarked. I won't remain longer than necessary. Don't be silly, Nathaniel waved dismissively. Your family. The days that followed were difficult. Every interaction with Mason felt loaded, as if we were both walking on eggshells. He began avoiding being alone with me, and I convinced myself it was for the best. Despite my best efforts to put the incident behind me, I found myself thinking about it more than I wanted to admit. One evening, I caught him glancing at me across the room. His gaze was brief, but it lingered. I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but the moment stayed with me. Before long, I noticed small changes in his behavior. He began coming home earlier, spending more time in shared spaces. One night, I found him in the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter with a glass of water. Sleep. I asked a question like that. He gave a shrug. We stood there in silence, the hum of the refrigerator being the only sound. He remarked abruptly, his voice low, "About the other day," and I immediately answered, "I am sorry." "You do not need to apologize. I shouldn't." He continued to look down, having just strolled in like that. "It was an accident," I admitted quietly. "Let's just forget about it," he said, locking eyes with mine. "Is it what you desire?" I was taken aback by the question, initially uncertain about how to respond. I stated it was for the best. Finally, he nodded, but his look indicated that he was not totally convinced. Things changed further one evening when Nathaniel called to say he'd be working late. I was in the living room looking through a magazine when Mason walked in, hesitant at the doorway. Wanting to watch anything, he eventually inquired. "Sure," I responded, putting the magazine aside. He sat next to me, and we watched in silence for a time. But the air between us felt thick with unsaid words. At one point our hands touched as we both went for the remote, and I felt a spark of electricity run through me. He instantly took his hand back, his cheeks crimson. "Sorry," he whispered. "It's okay," I answered, my voice quivering slightly. Gone, but a lingering sense of potential remained. One neither of us dared to discuss aloud. A few nights later, I found myself up far beyond midnight. The house was silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock. I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen to prepare tea, only to find Mason seated at the table with a mug of coffee, his eyes far away, the warm light casting shadows on his face. "Can't sleep either," I said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up surprised, then smiled faintly. Something like that. I got myself a cup of tea and sat across from him for a little moment of stillness before he broke it. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he inquired. His voice was firm and stuck, I repeated. "Like you're just going through the motions," he added, peering into his coffee, doing what everyone expects but never actually living for yourself. His words impacted me harder, more than I had imagined. I hesitated before responding. "Yes," I said gently, more frequently than I'd like to admit, and he glanced up at me, his eyes searching mine. "What do you do about it?" "I honestly don't know. I admit that I've spent a lot of time. Putting people first, Nathaniel, the house, I guess I never considered what I wanted." His eyes remained fixed. "Maybe it's time you did." His comments hung in the air between us, posing a silent challenge that I wasn't sure I was prepared to accept. That night, things began to shift gently between Mason and me, simple things like a lingering stare or a quick touch as we passed one another in the corridor. One afternoon, I was trimming the roses in the yard when Mason joined me. He asked, squatting beside me, "Do you even?" I inquired with a raised eyebrow whether he knew how to prune a rose bush. He replied with a grin that he had no idea. So I chuckled and handed him the shears. "Well, let's hope you don't kill it." As we worked side by side, I felt a sense of serenity that I hadn't had in years. Mason's presence was calming, grounding in an unexpected way. "Not terrible at this," I murmured, watching him gently clip a branch. "You're just getting started," he laughed. I urged. He grinned softly. "You have a good eye for detail." "Perhaps I learned it from watching you." The compliment caught me off guard, leaving me speechless for a brief time later that evening as we cleaned up after dinner, our hands brushing as we grabbed for the same dish. The touch was short, but it sent such a shock through me that I couldn't ignore it, Mason remarked, swiftly jerking his hand back. "It's all right," I answered, but my voice wavered. He paused before speaking again. Madeline muttered gently. I looked up, my heart beating. Yes, he appeared to fight for words before ultimately replying, "Never mind," but the stress in his voice told me everything I needed to know. My closest friend Chloe was the first to notice the difference in me. She approached for coffee one day, her sharp eyes immediately analyzing the situation as we sat in the living room. "You seem distracted lately," she commented, her tone light but probing. "Do I?" I answered, pretending not to notice. "Sure," she answered, leaning forward slightly, "and Mason has been present more than usual." Everything was okay, of course, I said immediately, but my voice sounded strained, and Chloe's knowing stare made it apparent she wasn't buying my act. "Madeline, I've known you for years and can tell when anything is awry." "There's nothing going on," I insisted, though her comments caused a knot in my stomach later that evening, after Chloe had departed and Nathaniel had retired to his study. I discovered Mason in the living room, scrolling through television stations. "Do you mind if I join you?" I inquired, sitting on the couch next to him. "Not at all," he answered. His smile was easy, and we spent the next few moments in quiet, the gap between us too tiny, but not close enough. After a time, Mason placed down the remote and turned toward me. "Can I ask you something?" he inquired, his voice uncertain. "Of course," I said, my heart racing. "Do you ever regret marrying my father?" he inquired, taking me off guard. "I have no regrets about that," I replied thoughtfully, "yet I sometimes worry if I made the correct decision." Mason gave a meaningful nod. "I have been thinking a lot about options recently." My pulse quickened as I turned to face him. "What kind of choices?" He clarified the genuine significance of listening to your heart. His gaze locked with mine, and the room seemed to stop, weighted with unsaid tension before I could respond. I stretched out and placed my hand on his. "Mason," I began, but the words became caught in my throat. He came in closer, his gaze seeking mine. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. The moment went on, delicate and trapped in time. Neither of us moved to destroy it, just when things between Mason and me were nearing their peak. Mason's ex-girlfriend Samantha appeared suddenly. She arrived at the home one day, her pristine look in sharp contrast to the mayhem she had left behind Mason. She muttered, dripping with sarcasm as she stepped in. "I've missed you. What exactly are you doing here?" Mason inquired, his voice cautious. "I wanted to talk," she said. I remained in the kitchen, out of sight, but paying close attention to their chat, flashing him a bright, fake grin. Samantha remarked, "I have been thinking about us. I made a mistake. I wish to correct things." Mason answered firmly, "There is nothing to fix. We were fine together," she reasoned, attempting to persuade him. While I listened, a sense of envy began to form inside me. Later that evening, as I was caring for the roses in the garden, Mason approached me. He explained that she would not be staying. He spoke in a firm tone. I didn't inquire, but rather answered, despite the fact that my voice betrayed me. He moved closer, his pretense. "You don't have to be concerned about her, and neither am I," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself. "You don't have to lie to me, Madeline," he said softly. Then, in a tender move, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The simple gesture was so intimate that it left me breathless that night. The fragile barrier between Mason and me broke after his quiet reassurance in the garden. I felt a pull toward him that I could no longer ignore. What was acceptable and what wasn't became blurred, fading into the background. It began with little moments, a lingering touch, a fleeting gaze, but the secret quickly became an addicting aspect of our bond. I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee the morning after Nathaniel went to work. Mason entered the room with mussed hair and a crumpled t-shirt. "Good morning," he said. I answered, still half asleep in the morning, my heart pounding slightly. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on me. "You're up. You are also early," I responded, attempting to seem nonchalant. We remained there for a few seconds, the tension between us palpable, until Mason gently strolled across the room. Madeline whispered softly and sat alongside me at the little breakfast table. My heart quickened as I glanced up at him. Yes, his fingers brushed across mine, sending a thrill through me. "And I can't stop thinking about you." "I admit," Mason began, but then shook his head. "Do not say it's wrong," he whispered quietly. We both understand that it does not feel that way. I wanted to stop him from saying something that would halt this blossoming connection, but instead I allowed him grasp my hand. The warmth of his contact muffled any objections I may have had as the days went and Mason and I became specialists. At Deception, we discovered ways to be alone without arousing suspicion, such as an intimate time in the garden or a peaceful hour together in the study when Nathaniel was out. Each stolen moment was exhilarating. But it also took a toll. The continuous worry of getting discovered hovered over us like a dark cloud, threatening to wreck all with a single error. Chloe, ever alert, began to detect changes in my conduct. Madeline popped by unexpectedly one day, catching me off guard as I came down the stairs, and she remarked, her eyes narrowing as she carefully observed me, "You've been avoiding me." "I've simply been busy." "Too busy for your best friend?" she said, trying a grin. She inquired, her tone light yet harsh. I hesitated, wondering how to react. "So it's not like that." What did she press? "Something is going on, and I believe I know what it is." Her comment sent shivers down my spine, but I kept my expression calm. "I am not sure what you are talking about." Chloe's stare stayed on me for a bit before she groaned. "Just be careful, Madeline. Whatever you accomplish, it is not worth losing everything." Her warning stuck with me. Even after she departed, Samantha's trips to the home increased, and I couldn't escape the suspicion that they were intentional. One evening, she came suddenly with takeaway in her hand, her bright smile concealing her genuine intentions. "I thought I'd bring dinner," she said. I tried to hide my annoyance by holding out a thoughtful bag of food. Mason's reply was nice. "But thank you, Samantha, but you didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she admitted. "I've missed us." The atmosphere in the room was overwhelming, so I excused myself and went to the kitchen to prepare the table where I could hear their talk. Samantha nearly begged us to try again, with each syllable biting deep. "There's nothing to attempt," Mason said firmly, his tone determined. Her chuckle was sour, "and you're concealing something. I feel it." I held my breath, hoping Mason would not falter. "What I do isn't your concern," he replied, his voice chilly as Samantha departed. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had formed in my chest. That night, Nathaniel arrived home earlier than planned, surprising Mason and me in the study. We'd been going over some papers, but our weak pretext broke apart as the front door opened, and we raced to separate Madeline and Nathaniel, who cried out from the corridor, "In here!" I answered, my voice strained as I swiftly moved away from Mason. Nathaniel entered the room, his brow furrowing as he observed the scene. "What exactly are you two doing?" he inquired. Mason was only helping me organize some old files. I answered hastily, nodding to the stack of papers. Nathaniel's eyes lingered on us for a while, his skepticism evident. "Dinner's ready," he murmured, though his glance told me he wasn't persuaded. Once he left, Mason turned to me, his expression tight. "That was excessively close." I know I muttered, my pulse hammering from the close call. The ongoing secrecy was wearing on both of us. Mason became angry and expressed his displeasure during one of our late-night conversations. "I can't do this anymore," he murmured, pacing the living room. "Please, Mason." I tried to calm him down, saying, "I'm tired of pretending. It's as if we're telling a falsehood when we sneak about." I stepped up and put a hand on his arm. "We don't have many options for calming him down." "There's always an option," he said. His gaze is fixed on me. "You must determine whether I am worth the effort." His words left me speechless for a moment, leaving me unsure of how to respond. But I soon realized that this couldn't continue indefinitely. Chloe's suspicions escalated when she approached me. During one of our coffee outings, she laid her mug down firmly, her face solemn. "Madeline," she said, leaning closer. "Are you having an affair?" I halted, struck into silence by her bluntness.
"You don't have to lie," she murmured, lowering her tone. "I saw the way you looked at him, and I gulped hard, attempting to compose words. Chloe raised a hand to stop me. I don't need specifics. Just consider what you're risking for him. Her comments sliced through me, leaving me disturbed. The notion of what I was doing to my life and everyone around me hit harder than I imagined. Samantha's perseverance finally reached a climax when she addressed Mason directly. I overheard their dispute in the driveway, her voice shrill and accusatory. You're concealing something, she continued, and I'm going to find out what it is. Mason's reaction was calm but forceful. Samantha, you need to go on, not until I know the truth. Their interaction triggered waves of terror. If Samantha found out the truth, everything would fall apart. Samantha chose to escalate the situation, which further complicated matters. She cornered me in the yard one day when Mason was gone. Her grin was pleasant, but her remarks were tinged with something darker. Lovely roses, she murmured nonchalantly. She brushes her fingertips over a blossom, as if appreciating it. Thank you, I answered, trying to remain cool. You know, I've been thinking a lot about Mason recently, she said. He's been acting differently. Do you have any knowledge of secretive, guarded situations? I pushed myself to grin. Mason has been through a lot recently. I'm sure he simply needs time. She cocked her head, her grin wavering, and wondered whether there was more to it. I'm not sure what you are implying. My voice was calm. Despite my growing terror, she took a step closer, her eyes penetrating. One thing you should know is that I will not back down. Her remarks stayed in the air as she walked away, leaving me scared and apprehensive of what would happen next. Evening Chloe arrived at the home, her mood angry. She didn't even give me the opportunity to meet her. Madeline murmured, shoving past me into the living room, "We need to talk." My heart sank as I slammed the door behind her. "Chloe, now isn't a good moment." Too bad she interrupted. "I've tried to give you room, but I can't be quiet any longer, please," I said, but she stopped me off. She said, "No more excuses. I know there's something going on between you and Mason, and I'm curious how long it will be until Nathaniel figures it out." Her words stung, and I couldn't hide from them any longer. "You don't understand," I said. She whispered softly, "Then make me understand. Madeline, even though I am your friend, you are recklessly risking someone's life." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I slumped into the couch. "I didn't plan for this to happen, but it did," Chloe replied softly, "and now you have to decide what you're going to do about it." When I informed Mason about the argument with Chloe, he was furious. "Who does she think she is?" Snapped, pacing the living room. "She's my buddy," I added, but my voice lacked confidence. "She doesn't understand," he said forcefully. "No one does, Mason, please." Standing up to face him, I remarked, "This cannot go on forever." His eyes became softer. His irritation, however, was still palpable. "Do you have any regrets about it?" I was surprised by the question. "Guard, no," I answered honestly, but that didn't make things any easier. He moved closer, his voice soft. "We'll sort it out together." For a minute, I wanted to believe him, but the weight of truth was too hard to ignore. The situation at home worsened, leading to a heightened conflict between Mason and me. Nathaniel began to discover the flaws in our veneer, with tiny comments and offhand statements about Mason's frequent presence or my preoccupied manner. It didn't take long for his skepticism to morph into full-fledged alarm. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Nathaniel's tone transformed. Mason added, his voice rougher than normal, "You've been spending a lot of time here recently." Mason paused, staring at me before saying, "I've just been helping out around the house," which Nathaniel echoed sarcastically. "Interesting." I faked a grin, attempting to lighten the mood. "He's been a huge help with the garden." Nathaniel took a long glance at me before returning his attention to Mason. The statement hung in the air like a gloomy cloud, suggesting that it might be time to start searching for your own home. Mason's jaw tensed, but he did not say anything. Maybe he mumbled after supper, but Mason and I retired to study, and the weight of the situation grew terrible. His annoyance had now reached its peak. This isn't working, he stated, his voice low but forceful. I know what I said, my heart sinking. I can't keep pretending, he said, his voice begging. I need more than this, more than snatched moments and lies. Please, Mason, I pleaded, tears welling up in my eyes. He drew closer, holding my hands. Come with me, Madeline, and leave everything behind. His words hit me hard, but I couldn't bring myself to face the weight of my responsibilities. My marriage and the life I had built were too heavy to ignore. Before I could make a decision, Samantha returned, this time with more than just suspicion. She confronted Mason directly, her voice loud. I know what you've been up to, she remarked in a spiteful tone. Mason crossed his arms, his face serene yet resolute. What are you talking about? Don't play. You're stupid, she said angrily. Mason, I saw you with her. I've got proof. My heart dropped as I watched from the window. Her words were like a dagger directed right at us. If you attempt to deny it, I'll make sure everyone knows, she said, her voice quivering with wrath. Mason did not reply, but the harm had been done. Inside, I found him pacing the kitchen with a cloudy expression. We must take action in the face of frustration. He asked in an agitated tone, What do you mean, I inquired, my voice wavering. Samantha won't stop, he muttered, his mouth tense. If we don't, she'll destroy everything. But how I asked, feeling powerless, I'll talk to Matthew, he said. No, Mason, I said, worry seeping into my voice. Both Matthew and she are hazardous. Met his steely stare, and as he departed, a profound sinking sensation sank in my gut. Later that night, Mason returned. His grim countenance and the tightness in his body told me all I needed to know. His talk with Matthew didn't go as planned. What exactly happened? I questioned in a whisper, and he collapsed into a chair, scratching his temples in anger. He is aware of what I gasped. Samantha explained everything to him. Mason answered quietly. Now he's threatening to... I felt a knot rise in my throat and told Nathaniel we had to go. He nodded. Leave together. That is the only way to stop him. I paced back and forth for hours, torn. Between my obligation to Nathaniel and my evident want to be with Mason, he sat silently and intently studying me. I knew I needed to make a decision, but I wasn't prepared. So what about Nathaniel? Mason stood and went toward me, his gaze gentle but determined. What life, Madeline? He softly said, a life in which you are invisible and your happiness is unimportant. His comments came at me like a smack. I can't simply walk away, I explained. My voice trembled. He whispered, softly touching my face. All you have to do is select. Before I could respond, the decision was snatched from me. The next morning, Nathaniel met me in the kitchen, his face pale and his grasp on his phone tight. Madeline replied with a shaking voice. Is there anything you'd like to say to me, despite your barely held anger? I stopped moving. What are you talking about? Panic is building in my chest. He flung the phone on the counter, and I noticed a screen packed with texts between Mason and myself. Nathaniel snapped. Don't lie to me. I've seen the texts. I understand what's been going on. I opened my lips to speak, but nothing came out. How long, he demanded, his voice rising, has this been going on? I glanced down, reluctant to meet his stare. How long, Nathaniel and I? Madeline yelled, his voice filled with pain. Months, I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. Nathaniel's laughter was bitter and cruel. Months. While I was out working, building this life for us, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. At that moment, Mason entered the room, his face hardened as he took in the scene. Nathaniel said calmly, This isn't just her fault. Nathaniel turned on him, fury in his eyes. Don't you dare defend her, he growled. You were meant to be my son, and you betrayed me.
I didn't plan for this to happen, F continued, his voice firm despite the fury raging around him. But I love her, Nathaniel sneered, his skepticism evident. You think this is love. This is nothing but greed. The dispute erupted. I tried to interfere, but my voice was drowned out by their rage. Get out, Nathaniel eventually muttered, his tone icy and definitive. Please leave my house, Nathaniel, I implored, but he turned away with a harsh grimace. I don't want to hear it, he muttered. You, Mason, and I made our decision. We packed our belongings in quiet, and the weight of our decisions lingered thick in the air as I took my luggage to the car. I felt a sense of regret as I looked back at our house. Are you sure about this? I questioned Mason as we got into the vehicle. He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixated on the road ahead. Are you? I said nervously, the magnitude of the situation settling over me. The one who is supposed to be here? I don't know, he responded just as we turned onto the highway, and my phone buzzed with a notification. Samantha sent a message. I hope it was worthwhile. The message contained a link to a social media post, and upon accessing it, my emotions quickly soured. The post included images of the chats between Mason and me, as well as a nasty caption. Some secrets can't stay hidden forever, she told everyone. I muttered, my voice quivering, and Mason looked across at me, his mood deepening as he let them continue. He insisted it didn't matter anymore, but as the alerts started to come in, I understood how much it did. The fallout was immediate and severe. Friends and relatives turned their backs on me, their judgment harsh and cruel. Nathaniel filed for divorce almost immediately, severing all ties with me and leaving me to rebuild my shattered life. Mason attempted to provide stability, yet he was unable to protect me from the ensuing turmoil. The strain of our decision became increasingly apparent, and the cracks in our relationship began to show one evening as we sat in our small rented apartment. Mason turned to me, his expression heavy. This isn't what you wanted, he said softly. I gave him a glance. Tears welled up in my eyes. It's not what you wanted either, I responded gently. We sat in quiet for a long time, the weight of our decisions crushing down on us. Eventually, Mason stood and walked toward the door, pausing before looking back. At me one more time. He remarked, I'll always care about you, but we can't keep doing this. And then he was gone. In the months that followed, I attempted to reconstruct my life, which was not easy. The whispers and judgment from everyone around me were constant reminders of my mistakes. But in the quiet moments, I found a sense of clarity for the first time in years. I began to think about what I truly wanted. Not for Nathaniel, not for Mason, but for myself. Looking back, I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could learn from it, and maybe in time I could find a way to move. The weeks after Mason left were the hardest of my life. The apartment felt impossibly Nathaniel's withdrawal, while expected left a hollow aching. Friends I believed I could rely on had vanished, their judgment too heavy to disguise under polite discourse. But I knew I couldn't afford to wallow in my sorrow. The initial steps toward rebuilding were hard, but essential. I got a job at a small art supply store, where I spent my days surrounded by brilliant paints and blank canvases, symbols of untapped promise. Though I seldom touched them, Chloe was the first to reach out. I'm not here to lecture you, she remarked over coffee one morning, her voice gentler than it had been during our last talk, but her eyes still held a hint of caution. I appreciate it, I responded, curling my hands around the warm mug. I just want to know, she asked. Are you okay? I paused, wondering how to respond. I'm not sure, I concede, my voice barely above a whisper, but I'm trying. She gave a nod. Months later, just as the wounds were beginning to heal, a knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the box to see the fragile item I had finally discovered, I stopped. This was Nathaniel. Nathaniel was older than I recalled, his face creased with tiredness, yet his presence still held the same weight, filling the little room with unsaid tension. Can we talk? He asked, his tone unexpectedly calm, and I stood aside, motioning for him to come in. He hadn't. Instead of standing at the window, staring out at the city below, I thought I'd hate you, he continued quietly, for what you did, what you ruined. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands writhing in my lap. I let Nathaniel continue. He paused, turning to face me. I expected to despise you, but all I feel is regret for us and what we may have become. His words impacted harder than any charge. I wanted to declare that I did not want to hurt him, but no words came. I know he said it quietly, with a heavy glance, but it doesn't make it easier. We talked for hours, revisiting moments from our marriage that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt monumental. By the time he left, the anger between us had subsided, replaced by a quiet understanding. Mason's departure left a different kind of void, one filled with questions I couldn't answer. Where had he gone? Did he regret what we had done? Did he think of me in the same manner as I did one evening? When I finished up at the shop, I discovered a note slipped behind my windshield wiper. My pulse raced when I recognized Madeline's handwriting. I thought leaving would make things easier, but it hasn't. Still thinking about you and us. I wonder whether you've gone on and found the bliss I couldn't provide. I hope you've taken care of yourself, Mason. The letter was unsigned, but did not have to be. Every word. I felt a mix of relief, regret, and a little selfish hope that I hadn't been forgotten. I initially resumed painting after being inspired by the letter. It was merely a method to fill the solitude, a distraction from the turmoil in my thoughts, but as the canvases filled with color, I felt a part of myself return, a part that had been gone long before Mason came into my life. Chloe came by one day, her interest intrigued by the unexpected burst of creativity. "These are magnificent," she said, her eyes wide as she surveyed the paintings adorning the walls. "Many thanks," I remarked with a hesitant smile pulling on my lips. "You should show these," she added, her tone urgent. I don't remember where I started, but she cut me off. "Madeline, you should not mistrust yourself. You have something to share." A year after he departed, serendipity brought him back into my life. I was attending a gallery opening. When I noticed him across the room at my art opening, he appeared older, but his presence still had the same seductive draw. "Madeline," he remarked softly as he approached Mason. My heart raced as I responded, and for a moment we remained motionless. The buzz of the room faded into the background. "You did it," he eventually whispered, nodding to the paintings on the walls. "I had to," I answered, my voice firm for myself. He nodded, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his lips. I'm proud of how we spoke for hours that night, catching up on everything and nothing, and by the time the gallery closed, the air between us was filled with a peaceful understanding. Mason did not remain in town. His departure did not leave the same anguish as before. Rather, it seemed like the end of a chapter. As I stood in my studio, surrounded by the colors and textures of my new life, I understood that while the past will always be a part of me, it didn't have to define me. For the first time in years, I felt at ease.